I have a problem. I've been trying to find the right audio solution for gaming for years. I have tried dozens and dozens of products. I've tried everything from the best IEMs on the market to wireless headphones like the Odyssey Maxwell to other audio solutions like the shit Gunner. And nothing quite cuts it for me. The Maxwell is a great wireless headphone. And if you need wireless, it's probably my number one pick. Full stop. But the headphone that I use is the 38X, and the reason why I use it is because it's lighter weight, it's more comfortable, I think it sounds better, and quite frankly, I think that I just play better with the PC38X. The Gunner was actually pretty close to perfect, but after using it for months, there's a couple issues that I didn't like about it, a couple things that became problematic. The sound tuning options here, I almost always left off. After a certain point, I just stopped using them entirely, not even to play around with them. I just leave it alone. 2, there are different sized inputs. This uses a 6.3 mil for the headphone output and a 3.5 mil for the microphone input. So you have to use an adapter, which makes the cables kind of a little funky and it doesn't quite look as clean as it should. Problem number 3 is that this thing only has one output for headphones. And problem number 4 is that there is no microphone volume control or mute switch. Now the K7 fixes all of these problems, has a better DAC, has EQ, more headphone output power, and Bluetooth, and it costs less. Everybody, welcome to the K7. What I have been personally using for years at this point is the PC38X. This is actually probably the single headphone that has the most amount of used hours in my entire lineup. So much so that it's probably time for me to buy another one coming up here pretty soon. Now this headphone, like many others, has a dual 3.5 millimeter connector on the end, one for the microphone and one for the actual speakers inside the headphone. Not only does the K7 have a matching 3.5 millimeter for the input and the headphone output, but it has an additional balanced output 4.4 millimeter. Now this means that not only can you plug in your gaming headset, but you can also plug in a hi-fi headphone at the same time and switch between the two. So having this comparison wasn't something that I could previously do on the same device with any of the other products that I've personally looked at. Also with the physical volume control on the 38X, I can physically mute this headphone when I'm not using it and just listen to the hi-fi headphones from the amp, and I don't have to unplug and replug anything. Now I want you to listen to all the features that this thing has because it's actually packed. This has over 2 watts into 32 ohms out of its balanced output. It has bass and treble EQ adjustments, 12 dB up and down for bass and 6 dB up and down for treble. Unfortunately, it doesn't have any mid-range adjustment EQ options. This has a bypass switch, so if you have EQ adjustments, if you hit the bypass switch, it'll switch to non-EQ mode with no EQ whatsoever. And then if you hit the bypass switch again, it'll switch to the EQs you have preset. This has RCA outputs, and yes, those are applicable for both the bypass switch and EQ. So you can run EQ through the RCAs, which is sick. It's also switchable for the output, so the RCAs are not on unless you select the RCAs on, which then will turn off the headphones. This has Bluetooth and low latency Bluetooth at that if you plan to do any Bluetooth or wireless gaming. This has a microphone volume control dial and mute switch on the same button, and it will save your settings if you go into the bypass mode and then switch back. For inputs, they have the Bluetooth mentioned. They also have USB-C, optical input, and coaxial. And even though this does have an extra antenna for Bluetooth, if you choose to use it for a better connection, you don't have to use it. You can run this pretty clean out the back, actually. All of this comes in a really well-built chassis with pretty tactile buttons. It's actually surprisingly well-built for how feature-packed this is and the price point. And it actually has protection modes for overcurrent, overload, and overheating. If you do somehow overheat this thing, it won't damage your headphones. So to say that I'm impressed with the feature set on this thing would be a little bit of an understatement. This, because of its specifics for the outputs and the control you have over everything, is extremely useful. One thing that people don't really talk about when they talk about gaming headphones is that every game's sound design is different. And because it's different, you're going to have different games benefit different headphones' natural frequency response. And one headset that might be really good at one game might not be so well on another. For example, the sounds coming out of a game like Tarkov are vastly different than the sound profile coming out of a game like Call of Duty. They have different engines running the audio. The frequency response that they tend to use is a little bit different. The Call of Duty one tends to be a little bit kind of darker or more bass focused, and the Tarkov one seems to be a little bit higher up in the frequency range. And so some headsets tend to be perfect for one game, but they they may lack a little bit in another. Now, this is where some sound options and some EQ adjustments can really benefit a headphone, because you can now adapt any pair of headphones, whether it's a headset or a pair of IEMs or just a regular headphone, to benefit a little bit more from the game you're playing on. So while I didn't find some of the sound modes on the Gunner to be all that great, I think the basic EQ for treble and bass actually makes a huge difference for not just music enjoyability, but also complementing the game engine. So Call of Duty, you might want to boost that treble a little bit just to get a little bit more top end information and get a little bit more finiteness for directionality. Now, this also depends on the pair of headphones. Let's say you have a headphone like an HD 800S, which is one of the best gaming headphones, even though it's at a very premium price. That headphone is a little bit sharp and a little bit harsh in the treble, and you may want to cool it down a little bit with EQ. There's a lot of reasons to use EQ, and you can even use EQ for free, but the fact that you don't have to, and you can make some quick adjustments switching from game to game to game with just a couple clicks of a button in terms of a dial is pretty nice. Now, if you look on Amazon, there's actually a lot of relatively cheap kind of Chinese amps that don't have quality components, but have a lot of like features. And on a data sheet, they look really impressive, but internally it's kind of like a nightmare and definitely not worth the money. This one is a little bit different. This has a 4493 SEQ DAC chip inside, which would be a pretty good DAC if this is just a straight up audiophile grade amplifier, but this is actually touted more and marketed more as a gaming amplifier. So it's pretty cool that it's kind of bridging the gap between gaming people and audiophiles, because I think that that group is kind of converging more and more every day. That's kind of exactly the same market that something like the Gunner was going for, except this has higher quality internals than the Gunner does, with more options, more power, and costs less, like I said. When it comes to straight up sound quality, I think that this thing does sound really good, and especially considering its wide swath of features, it is still very impressive, especially with how much power this has. In fact, I consider this to be kind of competitive with even some of the best hi-fi amplifiers at this price. So the K7 is looking very, very impressive, save for one tiny little issue that's probably the only actual issue I have with this whole thing in terms of actual performance. And that's if you're running really sensitive IEMs, there is a tiny bit of a noise floor. Not a lot, it's not super annoying. When you're playing music or in a game, you're not gonna notice it at all. But if the audio is off, especially if you're in a mode like PCM, you're gonna hear a little bit of that feedback noise. Just a tiny bit. Now, I think that they have absolutely knocked this thing out of the park, and I would already consider this to be a 10 out of 10 product. There are a couple ways where I think that they could go above and beyond if they really wanted to make like just a god tier product, even though I think it's pretty good already. One would be having the option to hear your microphone audio loop back into your headphones. I would like this to be on a switch and not a mandatory thing, but it would be nice to have. Another thing is that the microphone input only works in USB mode. It doesn't work in things like Bluetooth, for example, where maybe I want to take a call without having to take off my headphones and I have this hooked up to my phone via Bluetooth. It'd be nice to be able to talk through Bluetooth from my headset to a Bluetooth device. 3 is I wish there was finer volume control, because as of right now, the volume goes up in chunks of 3, even though I feel like it could easily go up in chunks of 1 with some software, but for whatever reason, either I can't figure out how to make it do that, or it only goes up in chunks of 3. I would also like to see some mid-range EQ adjustments. That would be nice. Just the same kind of style EQ that the bass and treble has, just for a mid-band. And then the very last thing is that the middle switch is for volume and gain, but I wish they would actually add one for mute. I wish it would be a long press for gain, a short press for mute, and then your volume dial as usual. Also, if you really wanted to make me happy, make this in white, that would be sick. And if I could add anything to my Santa wish list here, Fosi, if you're watching, I would love a K7 Pro of this that had XLR 4-pin headphone outputs. I would also love phantom powered XLR microphone inputs for professional level microphones like this one. That would be absolutely sick. I think if you did it right, this would be an awesome interface for a ton of different streamers and gamers and content creators, or people who just want to use a really high quality microphone for their computer audio, which I actually know quite a few people of myself. And you could easily take all of my money for that. But yeah, as of right now, this is the single best solution for being a gaming audiophile that I have found that has all the features that I look for. K7 is a beast. So obviously this is a 10 out of 10 product. It's insanely good. End of review.